Hi, welcome back to the channel and a new review today. Hope you all had a good New Year's and enjoyed the holiday season and are now looking forward to some of the new movies we've got coming out in 2025. Quite a lot to be excited about, I think. And we're starting out strong today talking about Robert Eggers' new film Nosferatu. So this was one of my most highly anticipated films of the year. I did talk about it in a video I made for that last year because I thought that trailer looked amazing, and I thought if we're going to have another adaptation of that Nosferatu Dracula story, Eggers is definitely the guy to do it because he directs films in such a way that captures the aesthetic and the atmosphere that perfectly suits this story, I think. So of course this is pretty much a remake of the original Nosferatu, a movie which is over 100 years old now, which is just insane, but very impressive in its own right if you haven't had a chance to see it. But got quite an interesting history, that movie, like where the story of Nosferatu comes from, the fact that it was this adaptation of the Bram Stoker's Dracula story, and they kind of changed a couple of details and called it Nosferatu, and the Stoker family were not happy about this and effectively sued the creators of that film and tried to get every single copy of it destroyed because they just saw it as a complete rip-off of their story. And, you know, it's only through later years where they managed to piece back bits of the old prints, I believe, together and make the film. And it's gone on to be one of the most iconic and influential horror films that we've ever had. It's inspired so much of the work that's come on in the last 100 years in horror. It's kind of interesting to look back at to where this thing actually started. But even though we have had many iterations over the years of the Dracula story, the Nosferatu versions I have always preferred, just because I think they're a little bit deeper, they're a bit darker, they've got a more of a surrealist feel about them, which I think suits the source material. Whereas the Dracula films, you know, I think of stuff like the Hammer movies and Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, and they're a bit more what you get at face value. They're more campy, they're over the top, very theatrical, and they're good fun movies as well. I quite like them for the most part, but I think there's something about the Nosferatu ones that do a bit more for me. And as I say, Eggers was the guy to do this telling of Nosferatu. Two big questions I really had going into this movie was, is this going to live up to the hype? Which I would say just about it does. I think it's a very good film. Some people are maybe slightly overpraising it. It's not the best horror film of the last 10 years or anything like that, but it is still very good. And the other question is it the best Robert Eggers film we've had yet? And I'm still kind of debating this and kind of meditating on it. I think The Witch, or The Vivitch as we know it, is probably the one that stuck with me the most out of all his movies. Something about The Witch is so effective. It's just kind of stayed with me ever since I first saw it. The more I think about it, the more I like it. And maybe I just need a bit more time with Nosferatu. But what I will say is I do think it's his safest film yet to date, which might be a good thing for some of you because I know a lot of people really do not like The Lighthouse because of how insane that movie is. It's definitely a bit more palatable and less weird. Let's say there's still weird stuff in there, obviously. It's Robert Eggers. Of course you're going to get that, but it's a little bit more coherent than some of his other films. But getting into what I did really like about this one, I think the look of the film and the atmosphere is absolutely incredible. You know, the amount of attention to detail that has gone into every single scene is pretty mesmerising. Like literally every single frame of this movie is an absolute work of art. And just from the visual standpoint alone, this movie is worth seeing because it does look just absolutely fantastic. And I think particularly in the first half is where it's at its most effective, because with the Nosferatu story, for me, the first half of the events of the story are the most interesting to me, where you get this character of Thomas, who's this real estate agent, and he's going to have the meeting with this Count Orlok that lives out in this castle and is trying to seal this deal to sell off this residential home. And then he manages to get a kind of a grip in here and becomes obsessed with the wife, and this whole sort of darkness begins to overtake this village, which is his hometown. And that first half with the initial meeting and the first interaction with Count Orlok and the whole journey there where they stop off at the inn and you get all the locals who are all terrified of the presence of Count Orlok being around there. All of that kind of stuff and the mood of it and that sense of dread works so well. And that's definitely the most interesting part of the movie for sure. And as I say, with the Nosferatu films, they do have kind of a dreamlike and surrealist kind of feel to them, and that's definitely very much the case here. Like when you first get their meeting inside the castle, how the first night plays out, I just absolutely loved everything about that. When you get into the second half of the film, this is where you get the focus on the character of the wife, who is played here by Lily Rose Depp. And I was kind of actually surprised that he didn't cast Anya Taylor-Joy again, because obviously that's been his go-to actress. She's so talented and she just has like a very distinctive face, doesn't she? Like she's so unique looking and she just fits in beautifully to these period piece movies. So I'm kind of surprised he didn't go with her. I don't know what the reason for that is, but I have to say I haven't seen Lily Rose Depp in anything else before, but she is really impressive here. And for her performance as well, where there isn't a load of dialogue, a lot of it is performed in her facial expressions and showing her emotions, and especially when she's starting to become possessed by this force of Dracula. All of that kind of stuff is where she really shines, and she tells so much even without saying a lot. So I was really, really impressed by her performance. And something I really liked about this iteration of Nosferatu is the second half. As I've said already, that there's things in the originals where it loses a bit of steam, I think, as the story goes on. After you leave the castle, it wasn't as interesting, whereas here, they brought in some nice elements that keep you engaged the whole way through. So you have this whole thing where Count Orlok is obsessed with Lily Rose Depp's character of the wife, Ellen, and it's kind of this thing where at night she's basically taken in these dreams. She kind of goes into this trance where she desires Dracula and she's almost luring him in. And this whole thing is brought on by the fact that she's really struggling with the isolation and the loneliness whilst her husband is missing. And that is what basically allows this dark force into her life and brings the plague back to this town. So it's quite an interesting commentary on ideas of, say, these villages that would have these kind of plagues, and there'd be all these superstitious rituals on how they were going to find ways to get rid of it. And I think the kind of story of Dracula works really well within the context of this type of story, because on its surface level it is a very simple story. Once you've seen it a couple of times as well in the various iterations, you know what to expect. And because this is such a faithful adaptation to that source material, it's kind of going through it beat for beat again. But I did like all of the little extra details that were in here to always keeping it engaging all the way throughout. If I had anything negative to say about the film, some of the elements I was more mixed on. Whilst I do think Bill Skarsgård as Count Orlok is amazing to look at. He's becoming iconic for playing these villainous roles. Obviously came up with Pennywise. He just has one of those faces where there's something unsettling about him, and he does a really nice job here. He's under so much prosthetics and makeup. He looks absolutely insane. So once you get that kind of full reveal of what he looks like, it's pretty impressive to look at. But what I will say is I don't think this version of the character was quite as unsettling or disturbing as the previous characters. I guess because here he kind of feels like this more kind of hulking, villainous character. He's definitely intimidating. It definitely looks good. But there was something a bit weird and off about the previous versions that I think actually for this story works a bit better, because initially you think you're dealing with a person and not a vampire, and I think the transition between the two is nicely done in those older films, whereas here it's very clear this is kind of some big demonic force, so it's a little bit in your face, I guess. Maybe it isn't quite as subtle, so in turn it isn't quite as powerful with that. So that was one of the mixed aspects, and that does actually kind of tie into my one other negative I really had, and that was that the film is just not that scary, unfortunately. The trailers definitely made it out like it was going to be probably one of the scarier films of the year, but that's just definitely not the case. Like, I went with a group of friends actually, and a couple of them are not that good with horror, but they get a little bit anxious about these type of movies, and all of them came out completely fine. They didn't find it frightening at all. So I do think it should have been a little bit scary. I can't quite put my finger on why it's not. It doesn't really play out in it, I guess, like a proper horror film. It does feel like one of these kind of more gothic horror tales, something a little bit like Sleepy Hollow. It's more akin to something like that than your standard sort of horror fare, I guess, which is, no fault of the film. It's done what it's intended to do. I think I just wanted to come out of it a little bit more like shaken by it, I guess. I wanted to find it a bit more intense and a bit scarier than it actually was. But for what it was trying to do, I think it did a great job with it. But for those of you that absolutely love Robert Eggers and his movies, and you're interested to see his take on the Nosferatu story, this is an absolute must watch. I thought it was a brilliant movie, and I'm definitely interested to see this one again. I think it's one of those that the more you sit with it, the more you think about it, and on subsequent rewatches, you're going to get more and more out of it, I think. But yeah, really enjoyed the movie, and looking forward to hearing what you guys all think about it as well. So I'm going to give this one a 4 out of 5 rating. So thank you very much for listening to this review. As always, guys, really do appreciate all of you that support the channel by coming over to listening to me talk about movies and interacting and having all sorts of fun discussions with me about movies that are coming out. Really looking forward to all of your thoughts on the upcoming releases we have this year as well. So thank you so much. Do take care, and I'll see you next time.